supposed to be looking out for your brother, wanting the best for him.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just not kill him. Like, congratulations.
Well, when Jesus talks about loving someone as you would love yourself, I think that the thing about that related to this commandment is whenever we do something really dumb, our first thought is, how am I going to get out of this
Yeah.
alive?
Yeah.
And when it's somebody else who does it to us, our first thought is, how can I kill that guy because he annoys me? You
Yeah.
know, right? It's like,
Tear him down, in
yeah.
some way. Yeah. Ruin his reputation or whatever.
Yeah, it's like we first jump to self-preservation, but we should jump to the idea of preservation of all life. Welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy.
And I'm Caleb.
And you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we explore biblical topics that are relevant to your life. Today, we're continuing our series on the 10 Commandments, and we're going to look at what we're calling the 6th commandment, thou shalt not murder. So this commandment, I think, is the primary one that drove me to want to do a study of the 10 Commandments, because whenever I hear about a new shooting, like a new school shooting or something like that, I know that regardless of the gun laws in our country, school shootings will not end until we reach the heart and mind of every child with the moral truth that murder is not only wrong, but totally unacceptable in our society.
Yeah. Because it's coming from the heart. I mean, and this goes back to the Shema, like we've been talking about, that, whether he has a gun or another weapon, or whether he can get a gun illegally, if, the problem is the murderer. That's the primary problem.
Yeah.
Just taking the tool out of his hand is just a Band-Aid on an infected wound.
Well, for instance, if we had a gun sitting right here on the table next in between us, I wouldn't feel any more in peril than I do right now when there's not one, because I know you wouldn't use it to hurt me, and I wouldn't use it to hurt you.
I mean, there's been a fire poker back there the whole time.
Yeah. The same thing's true of abortion, right? Because I always told you kids when you were growing up, I'd rather live in a country where abortion was legal and nobody got one than in a country where it's illegal and people still get them.
Yeah, that was so weird when I was 4 years old. I was like, what are you talking about, Dad?
But, the idea there is that it doesn't really matter what the laws of the country are. And so we could have stricter gun laws, looser gun laws, whatever. As long as there's people who want to use guns to kill other people, then we have failed as a society.
Yeah.
And so
the law is just basically giving us a valid excuse to punish the people who do that stuff.
Yeah. And that's necessary,
it's
of course.
after the fact. Yeah, that's to deal with the ones who don't learn it growing up.
Yeah, it's like locks on doors that keep honest people out, I mean, anybody who wants into your house is going to kick the door down, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's why this commandment is so short, right? It's like one of the shortest of all the commandments. You shall not murder.
Mm-hmm.
Let's read it. I just did it, essentially, but it's in Exodus 20, verse 13, and also Deuteronomy 5:17. They both say the same thing. You shall not murder.
Yep. That's it.
Yeah,
we're done.
That's it. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for listening.
What would you do without us?
So sometimes saying very little is saying a lot or saying more, right?
Well, we had a Chesterton quote about that earlier. Remember the fact that it's a short list. The Ten Commandments is just a short list. It's evidence of the freedom under God's morality, because basically all things are permitted.
Yeah. I think it was the idea about if you don't follow the 10 Commandments, you'll have to follow the 10,000 commandments, because everything else will fall down on your head. Yeah, that's right. And the thing about being short like this, you shall not murder, is there's no exceptions, there's no arguments, there's no tolerance for anything else. It's short and it's sweet and it covers it, right?
Yeah, so it should be pretty straightforward, right? Ever since that command was given, nobody's ever murdered anyone, at least who was a believer, and nobody ever will. So
working out.
We don't have to worry about it.
It's working out great,
right?
Yeah, because like you said, there's been a lot of famous biblical figures even who have been murderers.
Yeah.
And so we're going to go back and look at some of those. And since you're our historian, you can lead us on the.
In fact, Moses was a murderer who was
That's true.
given the commandments.
That's true. Yeah. So you can give us some of the. We don't even have that in our prepared list. So that's a good one.
And I thought of it right now.
So, Caleb, you're the historian. So, as I said, so give us the biblical context for
Well, Moses was a murderer. Yeah. Well, so on the last episode, we went for honoring your mother and father. We went to Cain and Abel, and we're going to go back because Cain is
Yeah.
just such a great example
Yeah.
of what not to do.
Yep.
So I think we probably read every one of these words last week, but we'll do it again.
Well, and Cain's like the first person ever born in the Bible, and he's a murderer.
Yeah. So we got started off on the right foot. So Genesis 4:1-12. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." That's like Shane, that famous Western where he tells the kid at the end of the movie, once you're a killer for good or for bad, that's a label. You can't, because the kid wants him to stay.
Yeah.
Once he's killed all the bad guys, and he's like, "No, I have to move on." He's a restless wanderer, even though somebody had to do it.
Yeah.
He knows he'll never be free of that.
Well, in his case, somebody had to do it, but in Cain's case,
Yeah,
there didn't have to be any murder.
I was just
but
thinking
it's the same result. But
I was thinking applying that more generally, like we were saying.
Yeah.
It's not always a 1-to-1 ratio that anyone who dishonors their parents gets their eyes plucked out by ravens.
Right.
But when you see that kind of an end for somebody, you figure, yeah, he probably wasn't calling his mom on Saturdays.
Caleb's referring to our last week's episodes, in case you didn't listen, in Proverbs 30:17.
Yeah.
So about the ravens.
The same kind of thing here. Like if there's a guy who can't settle anywhere, he can't be grounded, rooted in the soil. He's just kind of moving on from one thing to another, wandering. Again, not that he necessarily is a murderer, but it's that's going to lead to an unsettled lifestyle.
Yeah.
And as we'll see, even you can have murder in your heart without committing it with your hand.
Well, the sad thing about this story is that before the murder ever takes place, God goes to Cain, gives him alternatives, says, "Hey, if you just do the right thing, everything's going to work out fine." And Cain, because he's angry, like we saw earlier in the verse there, he's like not listening to God, not taking the advice of God, which is usually a bad idea.
Yeah. And I mean, it starts even before that, but with it says, all it says is that Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil. Abel brought the fat portions of the firstborn of the flock. So the best thing he could have. So Cain's withholding something from God already.
Yeah, that's the presumption. It's not really stated as such.
Yeah, it seems to be implied.
Yeah. Well, so he makes the decision instead because as always we have a choice, and Cain has a choice. God's given him clear choice. You could just go back and redo this, do the right thing. It'd be great. And Cain's like, I think I'll kill my brother instead. But that is his decision, but it's not really a solution to anything.
Right.
And as Caleb said, it leads to this wandering lifestyle um, you know, because you're a murderer. Now, think about this commandment because God's trying to do the same thing for us that he did for Cain.
Mhm.
Like before we're ever in the situation, he's telling us, hey, just
That
don't murder
that
people.
applies to all the commandments.
Yeah.
Just from the get go, before he gives the rest of the law to Moses, he's like, here, these are the most important. Let's just
Hmm.
get that
Yeah.
clear from the beginning. And we still, as we were joking about earlier, a lot of biblical figures end up breaking one or the other or all of them.
Well, and they're literally etched in stone, like
Yeah.
the Ten Commandments. And he takes murder off the table forever, right? God takes it off the table. That is not something that you think. You don't consider it. You don't, you know, take it under advisement. Maybe I'll murder that guy. You
Hmm.
just you run away from that, and that's not an option. It's similar to like when you decide as a single person that you're going to get married. Before you get married, you need to contemplate, like our marriage advisor told my wife and I before we got married, don't ever even talk about divorce. Like divorce is not an option, right?
Hmm.
So don't bring it up when you're having an argument. Don't say, "Well, maybe I'll just leave you," right? Like that's not why you're getting married. If you think that right now, then just don't get married, you know?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. God's like, life is a privilege that you have, and part of that is not taking
Yeah.
somebody else's.
Well, like with the marriage analogy, if marriage is two becoming one flesh, what would you call it if you like rend the flesh apart, of another living being? Like maybe murder?
Murder, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just like with Cain, God's giving us great advice up front, that's going to help us live a better life and for everyone to live a better life because we won't be murdering them.
Hmm.
And so like in the case of Cain, he didn't listen. Our job is to listen.
I think the order that these come in is interesting too, because that all the commandments come in. Because the first several deal with God, right? However you number those, it's 3 or 4 with most traditions. And then next comes honor your father and mother. I've been stressing, we don't start with us. With like the enlightenment philosophy kind of worldview, you start with the right to life. That's where everything starts. And that's part of that problem we have in the modern world where we want to just take I want to take myself, put myself first and say, okay, how do I figure out the world from here? And the Ten Commandments is saying, well, good thing your mom and dad exist and conceived you, so you can even be having this thought process.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that comes before the right to life
Hmm.
is the respect of your parents, and
Well,
then
yeah,
and then it's the right to life because, like you said, if they're not alive, they can't. We can't even have a conversation about how to treat somebody. So
like we saw with the Sabbath, to getting to your point and fleshing it out a little more, the Sabbath was about God's creative process. So it's
mhm,
the seventh day. He stopped, he admired his creation, and he asks us to do the same thing all the time, you
mhm,
know? And so we should always be remembering our creator. And then with the parents, it's like the procreative process.
mhm,
We should always be honoring our parents who went through that ordeal for us. And then now we get to everybody else we share that common existence with. We're all created by God. We all have parents. You know, we've all benefited from that. And so we should help each other with the life that we now share.
mhm. Not long after this, everything just goes downhill. One thing I wanted to bring up in Genesis 5, it gives you like a little genealogy of Cain's descendants. And we didn't read this part, but after, God confronts Cain and sends him out to wander, Cain's complaining about it and like, oh, I- that's not fair. Somebody could see me and kill me. And God's like, that would be the definition of fair, actually. But, as a mercy, he gives him some kind of mark and says, anyone who kills you I'll avenge you 7 times over. And so it's kind of a mercy, an unnecessary promise that he gives to Cain. And then, think about how Adam reacted, right? When he was caught sinning, he blames, well, this woman that you gave me, it's everyone else's fault but mine. And then when Cain's caught, he's, he's just like, yeah, well, I don't care. What am I, my brother's keeper? You can't, well, somebody could kill me. That's not fair. And then, like 5 generations later, his great great grandson, I forget how many greats, Lamech, is bragging about having killed a man and says, if Cain was avenged 7 times, I'm avenged 70 times. Like,
Mm-hmm.
just the degeneracy.
Yeah.
So then in Genesis 6, we see this is the start of the flood narrative, and we see the state that humanity is in by that time.
Genesis 6, verses 5 through 8. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord.
Yeah.
So this doesn't directly mention murder, but like Caleb said, you'd seen the progression of it with Cain and his descendants, and you know that murder is taking place. It shows the progression from Cain, all the way to this point where everybody in the world is violent,
all
and
the
out of
time.
control.
Yeah.
So this just the presumption is it's even worse than whatever was going on with Cain and Abel. Now it's even worse. And you sort of see this in Genesis 6, 11 through 13, where it says, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So I think full of violence probably means full of murder as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know how it could not be, at best you could say, well, maybe it's unintentional, it's collateral damage. It's kind of like in like a kid's show, like superheroes or something. Or like they're not going to focus on the death part, but you're like watching people fall off of buildings and you're like, they're definitely dying.
Well, we've talked almost every week, it seems like, about how our sins were tied to the land, like the Israelites' sins were tied to the land. And here you see how the sins of men are tied to all of creation. When God made us the caretakers of the earth, and when we're not doing what we're supposed to do, the earth suffers for it too.
Yeah.
And here it's like, well, man's spun out of control, and everything's ruined. All the animals, all the land, it all has to be wiped out and start over.
Yeah.
Yeah,
he talks about the earth drinking Abel's blood, like receiving it from Cain's hand, and we've seen that where there's curses associated with the land in the covenant, and he has to eventually give the land a Sabbath rest from the people.
Yeah. So, but we also see the beginnings of something here that becomes a theme throughout the entire Bible, which is this idea of a remnant, where he picks Noah, and then we know he brings a remnant of the animals to Noah, and then they're all saved in the ark. And then that's, the theme of salvation that you see being saved through the destruction. And then the idea of renewal, after the destruction. And then eventually you get this idea of resurrection, that we saw that even in the book of Job, we saw that. But this idea that God's going to make everything new again, including saving from death.
Yeah. And that's the concept of God turning evil into good, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he allows the evil to endure because he's actually able to work it into a greater good,
Yeah.
into our salvation and into his glory and mercy.
And not long after the flood, right, in the biblical text anyway, then you see that fleshed out with Joseph and his brothers, which
it's like maybe the most famous example of that.
Yeah. So just to summarize, kind of give a background of that story, Jacob has this is the setup for the story of what is essentially a fratricide. Is a guy has 4 wives, 4 women that he has 12 sons from.
Yeah, and there won't be any sibling rivalry out of that.
Oh yeah, it's a total recipe for sibling animosity. And then to top it all off,
he had a favorite wife.
He has a favorite one, yeah.
And then he has favorite sons.
Yeah, favorite wife, favorite son. And so he gives special gifts to one of them named Joseph. He gives him a special coat, a special beyond anything any of the brothers have. And then Joseph, on top of that, God gives him dreams about his future that he's going to rule over his brothers. And then Joseph is dumb enough to share them with his brothers. And so
Yeah.
that goes real well. And so finally, Jacob sends Joseph to meet his brothers while they're out tending the herds out in the wilderness. And
It sounds like they're working and he's just hanging out with dad at home.
yeah, yeah.
So I go check on them.
And he has a little brother too who's not out there.
Yeah.
And so his 10 brothers are out minding the flocks. And so Joseph goes out and he's looking for his brothers. And then in Genesis 37, 17 through 22, it says,
So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father.
so it's a planned fratricide that gets thwarted by Reuben. So 1 out of 10 guys says, no, let's not commit murder.
Against our own brother.
Yeah, against our own brother.
Yeah.
So you can see.
That's kind of like Abraham's argument with God over Sodom and Gomorrah, right?
Yeah, if I
We
can
can just
find
find a few righteous
Yeah.
people in here.
10 people, will
Yeah.
you save the whole city? Well, he wasn't able to anyway.
Right.
So, but they don't kill him. They end up selling him to slave traders and telling their father that he's dead. So, his father still goes through the grief of thinking his son's dead. And so Joseph ends up, as most people know, becoming second in command in Egypt, and he saves his entire family from famine
In the world.
and the world at the time. Yeah. So then you work on your way on down to Genesis 50, verses 19 through 21, and it says, But Joseph said to them, Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. So you can see where the human capacity for evil is totally outmatched by God's capacity for good.
Yeah. We've talked about this before. I think you were the one that brought it up. The way that Tolkien opens the Silmarillion,
Mhm.
creation story there,
Yeah.
where God, the God figure in his fictional world, conducts basically like a symphony with all the angels, and their voices are like instruments. And then you have the Lucifer figure who decides to start making his own music, and it's discordant and brash. And he brings some of them over to his side,
Yes.
and then God halts everything, and then begins a new theme using the Lucifer angels music, and weaves it back in and makes the original theme better than before. And he does that like 3 times.
Mhm.
And then they find out at the end what they've been doing. The music was actually the creative process. That was
Yeah.
actually like outlining the world history before it happened.
Right.
And then throughout Tolkien's stories, this is one of the things he loves to do is have, he calls it eucatastrophe, a good catastrophe, where everything gets to its bleakest moment, and then suddenly, somehow, the evil is turned into good. And he loves to do that through his stories because he's emulating what God does.
So we've looked at a few famous cases of murder. So probably one of the most famous in the Old Testament, Caleb, is
Yeah, David.
King David, right? So
He killed tens of thousands.
That's true. Yeah.
We could sing a joyful song about it.
Now, David, in the story of David and Bathsheba, right? He famously sees Bathsheba bathing from the roof of his palace, and he summons her and he sleeps with her, and she becomes pregnant. While all the while, her husband Uriah is out fighting for David in war.
I have to wonder about both of them there. Like, she probably knew she was in sight of somebody,
Maybe.
and I wonder how many times he was like, what's going on down there?
Well, there probably weren't anybody but David who had a high enough
Yeah.
building to see anything from. But regardless of that, right? She becomes pregnant. She tells David. So David recalls Uriah from battle in the hopes that he'll go sleep with his wife,
Yeah.
and then it'll hide his sin. But it doesn't work because Uriah is an honest guy about it. He's not going to do that while his buddies are out fighting. He won't sleep with his wife. So then David sends this message back to the front lines with Uriah in 2 Samuel 11:14 through 17.
In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. He's carrying a sealed letter. That's his own death warrant.
Yeah.
In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. So, I mean, Joab is not exactly a moral pillar of virtue. There's times where he ignores David's commands, like not to kill Absalom, and he has him killed. It'd be nice if he would have, disobeyed this time when it actually mattered.
Yeah. I mean, David technically didn't commit murder because he didn't kill Uriah,
Yeah.
but he set up the situation to where there was no other possibility than Uriah was going to die.
Hmm.
And maybe David thought, oh, well, people die in war all the time. And he says that in part of the story when he's trying to justify himself.
Hmm.
But, he knew what he was doing.
So then, after that, when he's confronted, this is 2 Samuel 12, 1 through 10. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, "There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, 'As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity.' Then Nathan said to David, 'You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all of this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own.'"
So the reason I wanted to read that part is it's a really cool story when Nathan convicts David, of course, with the little parable that he tells him. But I wanted to focus in on how David knew the minutia of the law. If you look back in verse 6, David says, well, that man, he has to pay back 4 sheep for the lamb, that he 4 lambs for the lamb that he ate. And that's because David knows the law in its smallest detail.
Mhm.
Like Exodus 22 verse 1 says, "Whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep." So David knows not only that you have to make restitution for this, but he knows the difference between whether it was an ox or a sheep,
Mhm.
and how you pay back. It's 4 instead
Yeah,
of
the exact
5 and
number.
all this. And so he's trying to show off to Nathan, "Oh, I know the law. That's what should happen." And then Nathan's like, "Oh, really? You know the law? So, well, what about the 10 Commandments? You know those? You're committing adultery, you're killing
You
Uriah."
despise the word of the Lord as well. So there's not putting God above all else. There's adultery, and then there's murder, and I guess theft, because he just steals Uriah's wife. I don't. You could probably keep going.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
He's lying. There's a lie. He's covering it up.
So he knows the tiniest little law, but he's forgetting the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
And I think That's essentially what Jesus talked to the Pharisees about when they were being legalistic in his day. In Matthew 23 and 24, it says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel." And I think that's that kind of legalism run amok,
Hmm.
that the Pharisees were in the middle of, and David is kind of lost in too, where you're bragging about how much you know about the tiniest little law and neglecting the important ones.
Yeah.
And so we might call it, instead of legalism, in David's case, he's using it to mask his sin. So instead of legalism, we might call it illegalism because he's using it to cover up his major faults and covering up with all the little things.
Yeah, I've talked about this before. I think it originates with the theologian Franz Pieper, the idea that there are only two religions in the world: self justification and Christ's justification. And it's a very easy thing to fall into. I think we all, at some point, kind of slip into, at least occasionally, thinking about things this way. If my sin, my evil deeds, are uh, what incurs God's wrath, then good deeds must, bring His pleasure. Like it's a very simple fallacy to fall into, but that's not how it works. Because you can never, it's too late. Like the ground's already drunk Abel's blood. Cain cannot undo that. And Uriah, like you can't. You're a murderer, like Shane said, good or bad. You're stuck with that label.
Mhm.
So you can't undo it. And we're gonna have to be dependent on God's grace to justify us because we're not gonna be able to do it for ourselves. But this is what David's doing. This is what the Pharisees were doing.
Yeah. Well, we look at it as a quantity versus quality thing too. It's like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, I made this big giant mistake by murdering somebody, so I'll just cover it up with 50 nice little things. And
Hmm.
that'll make God happy. And it's like, no. And I think, you know, that same idea that David had, where if I can impress Nathan with all the little things I know about the law, but I'm forgetting the biggest things.
Yeah.
And that's why we're wanting to call people back to the Ten Commandments, because they obviously solve so many of our problems. And if we would learn them and practice them and then teach them first, we would be majoring in the majors
Yeah.
instead of majoring in the minors.
Yeah. Like how many sheep you have to make restitution with.
Yeah.
Like who cares? You slept with your neighbor's wife and then killed him. I don't care about the sheep anymore.
Well,
We're
there's
way past that.
there's so many things to learn in the world. And it's like, okay, it's like if you think about it as your desk at work, and like, okay, well, the first thing you had to learn the first day was the Ten Commandments. And then you sat them on your desk, and then like all the papers started coming in, and they're like buried somewhere.
Yeah.
And so you're trying to do all these other things. You've completely forgotten about the first things they told you.
And it's like every job now you have all like a ton of corporate training or
Hmm.
there's some government agency somewhere that's in charge of, as far as I can tell, just harassing your industry. So there's like always unnecessary training you have to do. It's like, yeah, your first day on the job, you're just learning this stuff that like has nothing to do with what anything that will ever happen.
But God taught us what He thought was most important in the Ten Commandments. And then we've sat them aside and we've covered them up with little trivial things that aren't important.
Mhm.
And so we do the same thing with our kids. We think, okay, technology is piling up so fast. Like every day there's a new
Mhm.
technology, a new thing. We don't know. We don't even know how it works. And the kids figure it out before us or whatever.
Mhm.
But it's like, I want my kid to learn all these new things so that they can stay up to date. And I want my kids to learn the latest technology so they don't lose their advantage. And instead, because that's totally wrong, right?
Mhm.
Like we should be teaching our kids the oldest things first, the oldest commandments,
The
so
things
they
that have
don't lose their
lasted.
soul.
Yeah. The things that have lasted.
Hmm.
20 years ago, whatever the most current tech, there's a progressive commercial, which I abhor all of them from the deepest depth of my heart. But there's a progressive commercial about that. It's in like the 90s, I think. So like 30 years ago. And like they come home and like somebody's come in and stolen stuff, and they're like, "Oh man, they took my VCR and my Walkman, all the latest tech," and it's like we're joking about it now, but in just 30 years, how much has the technology changed? It's all whatever is relevant today will be irrelevant tomorrow, as far as
Mhm.
the technology is concerned or worldly concerns. But the commandments are always going to be there.
Yeah, that's right. And that's because they are more important, you know?
Yeah. So we're speaking about Pharisees. Let's talk about Saul, who later will become the Apostle Paul.
Okay.
So he in Philippians 3, you have to make sure you read this in the right context, because it sounds like he's bragging, but he's talking about this issue about trying to justify yourself with the minutia of the law versus relying on God's grace. So in Philippians 3, 4 through 6, he says, "If someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the eighth day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for righteousness based on the law, faultless."
Yeah. So he was majoring in the minors here, like he's he's doing all the little things. He's
Yeah.
not talking about the fact that he was killing people. I mean, he mentions that he was persecuting the church, but he made him a better Hebrew, but it didn't make him a better person.
Yeah. He's saying, look, if the minutia of the law was what's going to save or condemn you, then like nobody did it better than me. I dotted
Mhm.
every I and crossed every T. So if there's hope in that, I should have hope in that, and I don't.
Yeah, because when we first meet Saul in the New Testament in Acts chapter 7, right, verses 57 and 60, it's in the middle of Stephen being stoned,
Yeah.
and it says, "At this they covered their ears, and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, 'Lord Jesus, receive my spirit.' Then he fell on his knees and cried out, 'Lord, do not hold this sin against them.' When he had said this, he fell asleep." And
And the next verse there.
yeah, because this started a general persecution
Yeah.
of the church led by Saul. And so it says in chapter 8, "And Saul approved of their killing him. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison."
So, and by the way, the this that the Pharisees were responding to was Stephen looking up and saying, "Look, I see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Father."
Hmm.
So, the confession of who Jesus is, and that's what they're killing him for.
Well, and when it says they laid their coats at Saul's feet, this is very similar to the justification that David, created for himself by having Uriah killed in battle. Oh, it's just an official act of war, and he just happened to die, and all this. I mean,
It's like Saul. I was just standing there while it happened.
Saul was giving them the okay to kill the guy by laying their coats at his feet, saying like, "Hey, I'll sanction this. It's okay for you guys to go do this."
Yeah.
It's an official act of
I'll hold your beer while you do that.
yeah. So he's giving permission basically for them. Hey, this is an act. This is an act of you're acting on behalf of God. You're
Hmm.
acting on behalf of the authorities here. So go ahead and kill this guy. But it's unjust.
Yeah. And I think that, it says Saul began to destroy the church here. I think he's probably, the next musical theme of Satan here, to borrow that, Tolkien's illustration, because he tries to, that it seems like he's got to be Satan's main tool there, right? It's his favorite hammer to bash the church with. And then all of a sudden Jesus is like, "Yeah, I'll take that." and and converts him, and he turns into, like the greatest of the New Testament authors.
Hmm. Yeah, and because again, what man meant for evil, God intended for good.
Yeah.
And so Saul, unknowingly, by persecuting the church, um, you know how our tendency is to not get out and do the thing we're supposed to do, you know.
Yeah.
But Saul terrifies them and scatters them, and now they're out evangelizing as they should have been doing in the first place, but they hadn't got out and left the area. Now Saul persecutes them, and everybody scatters, like
This
it
is when
says.
they had to move to Antioch, right?
What's that now?
Would this be when they had to move to Antioch?
Well, they moved to everywhere, like spread about all directions. So they took the gospel with them.
Yeah.
You couldn't even count, you couldn't even number the people that Saul, now Paul
Has brought to faith, yeah.
yeah, with his letters
Mhm.
and all of his
Well, and
evangelistic
how many people are,
effort.
retain their faith because of reading him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing is that we all have a decision we have to make. And God has made it for us, but we have to make it our own. Like, do not murder.
Yeah.
Well, we're not supposed to murder. We need to make that decision that we're never going to contemplate it or and entertain the idea, because we all have the capacity to murder, but we have to choose to do good instead.
Mhm.
So Jesus talks about this famously in Matthew 5, verses 21 through 26.
You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment." But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you're still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny.
So, hold on. Now I can't even be angry at you.
Yeah.
What about annoyed? Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, if you say something as simple as "you fool," then that's Jesus is equating that to murder.
So it sounds like we're going to have a hard time living up to that.
Yeah, can't call people names. Raka is an Aramaic insult,
Mm-hmm.
and this is introducing the principle here that like we've been doing for the whole series, that each command has a positive with it, because you have to. It's not enough to just not murder. Okay, like I haven't stabbed or shot anybody, so I must be fine. It's like, well, what's in your heart?
Mm-hmm.
Are you your brother's keeper? Like Cain hit the nail on the head there. You're supposed to be looking out for your brother, wanting the best for him.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just not kill him. Like, congratulations.
Well, when Jesus talks about loving someone as you would love yourself, I think that the thing about that related to this commandment is whenever we do something really dumb, our first thought is, how am I going to get out of this alive?
Yeah.
And when it's somebody else who does it to us, our first thought is, how can I kill that guy because he annoys me? You know, right? It's like
tear him down, in some way. Yeah, ruin his reputation or whatever.
Yeah, it's like we first jump to self-preservation, but we should jump to the idea of preservation of all life.
Mhm.
You know, when somebody, like we talked about in our Obadiah episode, when somebody messes up, when somebody falls, it's an opportunity for us to help them up, to build them up,
Yeah.
not to kick them while they're down.
Well, Christ also says that, even the Gentiles love those who love them. That's the easy part. It's easy to be nice to someone who's nice to you, but he's calling you to something higher.
Well, one of the reasons I included those second two sections there after Jesus talks about, don't even be angry. It talks about leaving the gift on the altar, and it talks about settling on the way, to court. Is that our tendency is to try to say, well, what are my legal rights here? What am I entitled to do? So, like in the case of, murdering somebody, if somebody murdered, somebody in my family, I would want them to be murdered, and found guilty and put to death. And so you're like, what are my legal rights? What can I do to get back at this person, And instead, what Jesus is saying, well, actually, if somebody even is upset with you and you were going to do something great for God, you should not do that. You should go and make things right with the person first.
Mhm.
That would make God happier than for you to go out and do something for him
Yeah.
other than that. And the same thing with the court. It's like, stop thinking about what all your legal rights are and think about the other person
Yeah,
and
this
how
is
you can be
the altar is
reconciled.
like an obligation. The court is a legal, right. So there's a spiritual, legal side of it. And Jesus is saying, don't ignore the personal side.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because Jesus has always seen that personal account, that there's a personal account and there's, he talks about money the same way. Like you got your
Hmm.
money. He tells the rich young ruler, why don't you just sell everything you have and give it to poor people and help them? And he's like, oh, I don't want to do that. He's like, well, you're not investing in the personal side. He's doing the same thing here with legalism.
Hmm.
He's like, just get rid of your legalism and just go out and make everything right with everybody. Stop worrying about catching them in every little thing you can catch them in to make them look dumb.
Yeah. So I mean, we can see this on a lot of Jesus' teachings. Thinking about the parable of the seeds, or how the leaven of the Pharisees, how a little bit of yeast spreads into the whole batch,
Hmm.
or the parable of the talents, where the different servants are given different amounts of money, and whoever's faithful with little will be trusted with much.
Hmm.
This kind of principle that you have to start with the small things, right? If you take care of the pennies, the dollars will take care of themselves, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just say, well, as long as I haven't murdered anyone or slept with anyone, like I'm fine. I'm not sinning and I'm in good standing with God. And it's like, no, those are the guardrails. But like the last commandment is going to be, about coveting, which is basically, as I've heard it summed up before. Somebody said, if I were to sum that up, I would say, don't want to do any of the things I told you not to do. It's this it's the saying, so don't even get close to that.
Yeah.
People will ask things like, well, how far is too far? Like, oh, if I'm in a dating relationship, how much affection or alone time, or like how far is too far? And Paul says, flee sexual immorality. So
Yeah.
fleeing isn't like, well, I wonder how close I can get my leg to the bear's mouth. Like, it's just, I wonder how far away I can get from it. So it's like the wrong mentality to have. How far
Yeah.
can we push the envelope?
Well, and like Jesus says, don't even be angry at somebody, right? Like this small thing is just like in his parable about the seeds, right? If the seed gets planted into good soil, it's going to grow and it's going to produce a crop.
Yeah.
And that same thing's going to happen with evil thoughts.
It's
If you,
yeah, good or bad.
yeah,
Like whatever the little
mhm,
habits are going to grow into bigger blessings or
yeah.
problems.
And the same thing's true with our children. If you think about it in terms of time, like start young with children and teach them the
Hmm.
right principles from the beginning. So when they become adults, they have it planted in their hearts and minds. That's why we've been focusing on the Shema so much in Deuteronomy 6:4-9. That's why we've been saying it's so important because you want to embed in your children all the principles that God's passed down to us to help us live our lives better. Now, this reminds me of a few years ago when I was studying the parables of Christ, and I was trying to figure out what was the first parabolic statement Jesus ever made. And, a parable is just like our mathematical word for parabola, where you have, two lines side by side going up, and you can see them next to each other. Well, that's the same thing with these ideas. You're throwing two ideas out side by side and comparing them to each other.
And one is the fictional story on, like, let's say, the negative axis. The
Mhm.
other is how that applies to real life on the positive axis.
Sure, yeah. You're comparing them in some way, and that would be one. And so, like, what was the first parabolic statement Jesus ever made? I was trying to figure out, and I went and read all the Gospels, and I realized that in Matthew's Gospel, when Jesus is tempted by Satan, Matthew chapter 4, in verses 1-4, then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God."
He actually said that a lot earlier than this when he was talking to Moses on Mount Sinai.
Yeah, well, it is quoting Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, about that passage there. But, I never liked this passage very much because Jesus had been fasting for this enormous amount of time that doesn't seem like I could ever practically do without dying. I can't do that, So I was like, that doesn't seem achievable to me. Like, I'd like to be as much like Jesus as I can, but how do I put this into practice? Like fasting 40 days.
Mhm.
And so I decided to rewrite the parable and try to understand it better, which is a good thing you can do if you ever want to rewrite it in your own words or in modern terms. And so I rewrote this and I call it the parable of the computer. A computer does not work on power alone, but by every instruction entered by the hand of the programmer. So after I rewrote it and I thought about it, I was like, okay, I see what Jesus is talking about. Like if I had a computer and every time I turned it on, it went to the blue screen of death or just didn't work,
Yeah.
I would just stop turning it on because it'd be a waste of
Yeah.
electricity, right? And Jesus was saying to the devil here, well, I don't need to eat bread right now because I haven't been given my program to run yet. I'm out
Mhm.
here in the wilderness trying to seek divination from God. When he tells me what my mission is, then I'll fuel the mission. But right now, I'm waiting to
Mhm.
get that mission. And when I thought about it that way, it made a whole lot more sense to me. So I started getting up every morning, and studying and praying before I went out about my day because it's important to have a message from God so that you know what your mission is, so you know what you're fueling,
Mhm.
right? And well, ironically and amazingly, the very week that I wrote that parable and I was teaching a class that weekend on that, and I shared it in the class, that was the same week as the Uvalde shooting in Texas, the school shooting in Texas. And the shooter in that um, incident, he was 18 years old. He killed his grandmother. Then he went and killed 19 children and 2 teachers in the school that he used to attend when he was little.
Mhm.
And it was a tragic, tragic situation. I started thinking about it in the context of this parable of the computer is, why turn it on if it doesn't have a good program to run? And I thought, somebody fed that kid 3 meals a day till he became a man,
Mhm.
but they didn't load any program in him that was worth running
Yeah.
because he got up that day and ran a program that was garbage.
That's your job as a parent. Like
Mhm.
legally, you have to provide food, shelter, and clothing,
Mhm.
until they're an adult. That doesn't make you a dad. That makes you a legal guardian.
Yeah.
It's like in that episode of MASH where Charles, like the upper class doctor, and Hawkeye, who had more of a middle class upbringing, they're reflecting on their childhoods with their dads, and Hawkeye's talking about goofy breakfast stuff like smilo face pancakes or whatever, and Charles was like, I would have between the salad and the soup to tell my family about my day, and he realizes you had a dad, I just had a father.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
there's more than just the necessities. Like I give my dog food and shelter. I'm not his dad.
Yeah. 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 And that's why we need to teach children the 10 commandments even in the schools, right? But even in our churches and in our homes, like we need to be teaching our kids the 10 commandments so that they have ingrained in their hearts that it's never acceptable to kill somebody. Like in the case of this commandment,
Mhm,
they need to have a good program to run.
mhm,
They need to know that they have a creator. If you just go back through the commandments we've already studied, they need to know they have a creator. They need to know to put him first in everything, right? They need to know that they should remember him every week and every day.
take time to rest and worship.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They need to honor their parents, right? And like we're talking about this week, they need to know
or
that
grandparents for
yeah,
him.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah, that's sad. They need to know that murder is not only wrong, but it's never an option. And then next week we're going to be talking about sexual purity. And so, you know, on that note, we need to know that abortion it ends a life.
Yeah, it's kind of a blending between the 2
Mhm.
commandments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's all these things that children need to learn when they're very young, so that they never depart from them, as we talked about that proverb last week.
Mhm.
Um, and we need to ingrain that in their hearts and minds.
All right. So going back to Matthew 5 here, kind of continuing that dialogue that Jesus has. This is verses 38 through 48. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's all you have to do. It's not that hard. Just be as perfect as God.
Yeah. Well, it's a good start, the Ten Commandments, to take you in the right direction. Now, I wanted to read this because I feel like the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is the best of Jesus' teachings here that help you understand your legal rights versus what would be much better.
That goes back to David, right? Oh, this guy's got to give 4 sheep. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, but eye for an eye was a huge advancement in the day that law was given by God, because it was a non-escalatory ethic, right? That you stop the escalation of violence. If somebody pokes your eye out, you're entitled to go poke their eye out to get back at them.
yeah,
That's all you were allowed to do. And if they knocked your tooth out, you could go knock their tooth out. But like we said last episode, there was a no vicarious punishment was allowed in the Old Testament. So if someone came and knocked out my tooth, and I went to go get them and I couldn't find them, but I found their son instead. I couldn't like knock their son's tooth out and say, "Ha! I just got back at that
yeah.
guy."
You
And
look at so I mean, just historically, there's in like high honor cultures, there are often like feuds and kind of killings of between families that are feuding. And but even in the Bible, you look at what happens. We talked about Jacob's 12 sons, but he also had a daughter. What's her name? Dinah, I
Dinah,
think.
yeah.
Yeah, and she is taken advantage of and raped by some neighboring people in the
Mhm.
land that they're at that time. And Jacob's trying to like he's trying to stay on good terms with them. His sons go out and just kill a bunch of them because of what they did to their sister.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
and Jacob's like, what have you done? Now I'm a I don't remember the word he uses, like a stench or I'm a sore to these people. I can't remember what he something, I'm unpleasant now to these people. They're gonna hate us because they escalated it.
Yeah. Yeah, and this advancement in the law was, okay, you can poke the guy's eye out if you poked your eye out, but nothing else. You can't kill him. You can't poke his son's eye out. You can't poke his whole family's eyes out.
Yeah.
Just get back what you were wronged, okay? Now that's what your legal rights were.
hmm
But Jesus is bringing this up to say, okay,
Who says you
sure.
have to assert the legal right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're perfectly within your rights to do what the Old Testament law tells you, but what if you don't?
Yeah.
Would that be even better? And Jesus is saying it would be. And that's where, you get to this thing about, I say, don't just not murder, but don't even be angry at
Yeah.
somebody. That's where he's coming
Like
from.
anyone who forces you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles. The Chosen, I thought, did a really good job of showing that in their show.
Yeah,
Did
they
you see
did.
that?
Hmm.
Where the Romans get Jesus and his disciples, and they make them carry their stuff. They're like putting their helmets on them and laughing at them.
Yeah.
And
So Jesus
and
drives this non-retaliatory thing
yeah,
home here
and then
by,
when they reach the mile marker, Jesus just keeps walking, and
oh yeah,
and the
yeah.
Romans like, hey, stop. He's like, we can keep going. You're not forcing us to because we're willing to do it. And then as they're walking the next mile, the Romans start taking back all their equipment because they feel bad, and they're getting close to the outpost. He's like, I don't want the other guys to see me, with you carrying all this stuff. So they're like getting really embarrassed by it. It's just like which Proverbs 25:25. 21 through 22, where it says, if you give your enemy food and drink, you heap burning coals on his head.
Yeah.
Because he's like, I thought I hated this guy, but he's being really nice to me.
Well, and here with the non-retaliatory ethic, Jesus is saying, if somebody slaps you in the face, of course you have the legal right to slap them back, but you could just not do anything about
Yeah.
it, and then that would bring everything down. And then he talks about loving, uh, your enemy and praying for those people when they persecute you. So there's just so many ways that we can, not assert our legal right and know all the minutiae of the law, but just to go back to the Ten Commandments,
Hmm.
and do the higher things. And in the case of Jesus, to practice Jesus' non-retaliatory ethic, to do the higher thing
Hmm.
when we have the opportunity.
Unless anyone's listening, then don't take advantage of us for that. Just because we're not going to get back at you.
So this commandment, you shall not murder, is all about making good decisions.
Hmm.
And I think that's captured really well by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount there. Um, God has already made the decision for us by taking murder off the table completely.
Yeah.
But we have to agree with him and keep it off the table.
Yeah. It seems like it should be so straightforward. And I think we just take it for granted because we grew up in Christian culture. But like we saw, Cain is the first person born at all. And he's a murderer.
Mm-hmm.
Moses was a murderer. David was a murderer. Like people who should have known better didn't.
Yeah.
And it seems easy to slip. And of course, they don't start. You don't just wake up and think, "Oh, I'm gonna murder somebody today." Like it's gonna start with something smaller, and you allow it to build there because you weren't guarding your heart against it.
Yeah.
You were focused on the minutia, of your own righteousness, keeping up the appearances.
So our 10 words takeaway for this session, the negative version, is murder is never an option. Don't even think about it.
Yeah, yeah. It's such a short command. Thou shalt not murder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and if we restate that positively, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
Yeah, and that's straight from Jesus Christ that we just
I
read.
thought you came up with that.
No, it's Jesus. I can't take credit for it. Not
Yeah.
not after everything he told me to turn the cheeks and everything.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know. Do you have any closing thoughts on Shana Murder?
I mean, it's a again, it feels like, oh, this should be so obvious, but you look around our culture, this is seeping, or the lack of respect for this command is seeping in on the edges. Um, I'll borrow from Pastor Brian Wolfmueller on his YouTube channel. I heard him say talking about this. He said he quoted 1 Peter 5:8, where the devil prowls around like a lion. And he said, I watch Animal Planet, so I know how a lion hunts, and they don't just go for any gazelle. They target the animals on the edge of the herd, or the sick, or the young, or the old, the ones that are going to have the hardest time fleeing or fighting back. And that's what's happening in our society. We look at how are the youngest and the oldest treated. You mentioned abortion earlier. Some people are
Mhm.
not even allowed to come into this life alive, and so that's it. That's the end of the discussion. There's they have no rights. That we can't talk about how we're going to treat them because they're not even allowed in. Or the oldest are shoved off into a retirement home, and um, this isn't as prevalent in our country yet. But you look at like Canadian healthcare, and there's euthanasia becoming more and more common for people who are elderly or who are chronically ill, and it's just a lack of respect for their life. I mean, what kind of self-respecting doctor or nurse can possibly consider killing a patient as the proper health care?
Mhm.
It's the opposite. We're going insane. So these things
Yeah.
are seeping in on the edges, and because the like you were saying, the children are not brought up right. They don't have proper respect for life, and so some of them commit mass shootings, or some of them go sleep around and then have abortions, and it's
Mhm.
it's it's seeping in at the edges. So this is, it's something we have to get back to and get right. It's not as obvious as it seems. It sounds like, everybody thinks, "Oh, yeah, well, duh," but they don't realize the ways that they live their life, and that they're their friends and neighbors are living their lives, that it's chipping away at this.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you want to try to start stemming the tide, if you want to try to start making a difference in your family and in your own life, then you need to find a group of people who are like minded, who all want to commit to the Ten Commandments and all of Christ's teachings. You want to get it into a church. And so that's why Caleb and I are always encouraging everybody who's listening out there to join a church if you're not already a member of one. Find a group that has a good reputation in your town, and they're going to be as committed as you are now to wanting to follow these teachings of Christ and the teachings of God. So he's Caleb and I'm Timothy, and thank you for listening to Bible Discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider subscribing to our channel to help support our efforts. All scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica Inc., used by permission of Zondervan, all rights reserved. This program is copyright 2025 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.